Everything we've seen is that Putin is not yet on a path to an off-ramp, and that he will double down. And the Ukrainian people are the ones that are going to pay the price, but so are the Russian people. And I think that's important to remember.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Washington Post national investigative reporter Carol Leonnig, and I'm pleased to tell you our guest today is the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. She's here to tell us her fascinating story and also give us some insight into the Russians, the war in Ukraine, and what the future holds for the Ukrainian people, NATO, and the world. Marie Yovanovitch, welcome.
Thank you.
We're glad to have you here, and I apologize to the guests. I'll be looking down at my notes a lot because this is a really fascinating topic, as is your book. I'm so glad to have you here, former ambassador, and to talk a little bit about your book, Lessons from the Edge. But first, let's get to the news of the day, which you couldn't be a better guest for our audience today after President Zelensky's speech. Tell us a little bit about what you thought of his call to President Biden to be a world leader and some of his specific requests.
I think what the world has learned is that President Zelensky is just a master communicator. He has pulled his own country together, inspired them, and united them. And he has also united the world. But this speech to Congress was also a cry from the heart that Ukraine is under attack. Ukraine is paying in blood for its fight for freedom, not just for Ukraine's freedom, but really in the fight of tyranny versus freedom. And freedom has to prevail. And so he's reminding us about our own history, how we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, how we were attacked on 9/11, attacks from the air. And significantly, of course, Ukraine right now is suffering from brutal attacks from the air because of Russian aggression. And so he's asking for U.S. help. Obviously, he wants a no-fly zone. If we can't do that, send the planes so that the Ukrainians can make a no-fly zone happen. And he's asking for a lot of defensive systems. And I think that it's important for us, as we say that this fight is our fight, that this is a battle between freedom and tyranny, that we match our rhetoric with our actions, or our actions with our rhetoric. And I think we are at the point where we should not be taking anything off the table. We at least need to consider all of these proposals, requests, and suggestions. And my understanding is that the Congress is doing exactly that, as is the administration, which has done a lot. And we know that later on today, President Biden is going to announce yet another massive assistance package for Ukraine. And that is very welcome, because every day matters now, because lives are being lost.
You've commended the Biden administration for some of its very organized efforts to box in Putin and to make him essentially feel a punitive weight for his decision to go into the country and invade and kill who knows how many people by the end of this. But you've also have some strong opinions about a no-fly zone, which the Biden administration has resisted and continues to resist this morning. Tell me what you think, tell our audience what you think about the value of a no-fly zone.
think we need to be seriously considering a no-fly zone for humanitarian purposes. Is there a way to do this that is prudent? Because obviously nobody wants to to widen a war. What we want to do is stop this war of aggression on Russia's part. So, are there places in the West where we could help the Ukrainians with that? And when I say we, I'm not necessarily talking about American pilots. I think Ukrainian pilots are perfectly capable of doing this. So I think we have a lot of really smart people in our government and in our military that are thinking about all of these things. And I think they need to be thinking as creatively as possible. What are all of the options so that we can support Ukraine and save Ukraine?
I want to really dive into your deep knowledge of Vladimir Putin, if we can. Tell me a little bit about what you think his long-term agenda has been. And then I'm going to ask you another question that readers ask me all the time, which is, why did Putin invade now under Biden, and why didn't he under former President Trump?
Yeah. So Putin, this is the $55 million question. What does he really want? But I think he has indicated what he really wants over time, over the last 20 years that he's 20 plus years that he's been in power. And he has done that through both his speeches, his writings, and his actions. I, his, I think he does want to control Ukraine. That is very, very clear. He has an obsession with Ukraine. And I think now he wants to make Ukraine part of the Russian Empire, part of the Soviet Union, however one looks at it. I think these are legacy matters for him now. And he is doing his best to make that happen, although clearly he miscalculated. The Russian military is not nearly as capable as presumably he had thought. So I think partly it's about Ukraine, partly it's about expanding even further because he has, the day that he announced the attack on Ukraine, or I should say the special military operations, since to this day, even though we can all see what is happening in Ukraine, he does not acknowledge that there's a war there. And in fact, I think that if you say the word war in Russia, that is punishable by 15 years in prison. That is where we have come to in Russia. So I think he does want to. So he has said that he feels that many of the countries that the new and independent countries that were established in 1991 after the Soviet Union was dissolved, that he thinks some of them should come back to the fold as well. And I think more broadly, he feels that the international order, the rules-based international order that we established after World War II, enshrining certain principles like sovereignty, the inviolability of borders, not attacking other countries, et cetera. These are good principles to live by, and a good way to manage the international order. But I think he feels that he can't win in that kind of an environment, even though this order has ushered in an era of unparalleled prosperity, unparalleled security, and unparalleled freedom for much of the world. So I think he's doing his best to move the world to a might makes right kind of a world. And I think that is a real concern for the United States because that will violate that will really undermine our national security interests. It will be a more dangerous, more complicated world, and one that we need to do our best to make sure that the values of the post-war order continue, rather than values, if you want to call it that, of a dictator like Putin.
I think it's fascinating that you use the phrase "might makes right," and I think that summarizes his world order position very well. What do you say to American critics of the Biden administration who say we're the superpower we're sitting a little bit on the sidelines in many ways, allowing this invasion to kill who knows, again, how many people ultimately in a country that is our ally and that we are supposed to be protecting. What do you say to those critics who feel that might makes right is actually working for Putin, even as unsuccessful as he's been thus far in the war? He is establishing some kind of beachhead there, and people that he views as an enemy are dying. What do you say to those critics who say we're not really using our full might?
I would say that right now, I'm very glad that we have a president and an administration that is carefully thinking about options. This is a time for prudence, and while we don't, on the one hand, we can't give carte blanche to a dictator like Putin. We also don't want to widen the war. We want to stop this war. But I do believe that we need to constantly be examining all of the options. And as I said before, keep them on the table, because we've seen just in the last 3 weeks that steps that previously had been off the table are not only on the table, but are being implemented. I'm thinking of, the really strong economic sanctions. I think that much of the security assistance that we are providing Ukraine now probably wasn't, something that we had been thinking about 2 months ago, 6 months ago for Ukraine, but now we are. Their facts on the ground are changing every day, sometimes by the hour. And I think you're also seeing not only leaders responding to this. I think of, the three brave prime ministers from Eastern European countries who took the train of all things to visit Zelensky, in his bunker in Kyiv. Tremendously brave, but because they feel that solidarity and because their people feel that solidarity as well. So I think, I don't know, it's been 3 weeks of this war. It's hard to believe because it feels to me like it's been 30 years. But who knows where we'll be in 3 weeks, and who knows where we will, what kind of measures we will want to be taking.
Do you think there is a face-saving way out for Putin, and what does it look like, Marie?
Well, we're hearing today, both from the Russian and the Ukrainian sides, that they're making some progress in their negotiations. I hope that's true. But what we're also seeing, and I would just say that Zelensky has said publicly now that he's not, he used different words, but he's not pressing to join NATO because the open door is not really open for Ukraine. But I think the Russians are continuing to attack Ukraine, not only military objects, but civilians and civilian buildings. They're attacking Ukrainian people, but also the culture and the history and the country itself. So on the one hand, we have negotiations, but there's no negotiated ceasefire while diplomats and others can talk. And so this is a well-known Russian tactic. They've done this in other conflicts, including in Ukraine in 2014, 2015. So I'm hopeful that maybe they are making progress, but I'm also a little skeptical of Russian intentions.
Rightly so. Let's please talk a little bit about the book that you wrote. You spent 3 decades in public service, a career as a State Department official representing our country abroad, not once but twice in Ukraine, if I have it correctly. What compelled you to write this book not long after you were thrust without your permission into the spotlight by former President Donald Trump?
That was a crazy time in my life, but I got a lot of letters of support from the American public, and they said, we'd like to hear more. We'd like to hear more about your life. We'd like to hear more about, the challenges of you've faced, and we want to hear more about diplomacy. And so, as I thought, I retired in January of 2020. As I thought about, what was I going to do next, I had the opportunity to write a book, and I thought I would because I thought it was so important to try, perhaps through the stories of my life, to try to share with people in the American public what diplomats do. I think there are stereotypes about diplomats that we are, quote, cookie pushers. We go to receptions and we offer people food and chit chat and have a glass of wine, and it's a pretty glamorous life, and that's what we do. And in fact, we sometimes do those things, but those are working events. And for an introvert like me, really painful to have to go out there, to yet another reception. But it's important because you're building ties, number one. But number two, you're always, as you're chatting with your host country interlocutors, you're always finding out information, and that informs what we send to Washington and how we and is critical to creating a sound foreign policy. So it's really important work. But there are other things. I started my career, managing port operations and the garage and fueling up generators and cars in the country of Mogadishu, where nothing was easy and there was a lot of corruption. But it was important that we did those things because I was providing the administrative support for our diplomatic mission. Later on, I served in many countries of the former Soviet Union, and we wanted to build ties with these countries that had previously been communist. And they said to us, "We want your help," including Russia. "We want your help in establishing democracy, establishing a market economy here, and in progressing." And so that was really important work, but not easy work. And we didn't always get it right, but I think mostly I like to think that we did.
It seems that you worked in several scandal-plagued, or I should say corruption-plagued countries. What did you learn in places like Mogadishu and in other previous postings that helped prepare you for the corruption you encountered when you were posted to Ukraine?
Well, it's interesting because it was in the writing of this book that I realized what you just said, that corruption had been a really big issue in a number of the countries that I've been to or I served in. And in Mogadishu at that time, I was very junior, but looking back at it, and even at the time, we did not call out corruption. We didn't have an anti-corruption program, as far as I'm aware. It was all about the military, our security position. This was during the Cold War. Somalia was kind of a client state of the United States, and it was important that we have a strong military relationship with Ukraine. So it was all about that. And we didn't really talk about the things that we talk about now, democracy promotion or anti-fighting corruption, et cetera. And even in my first tour in Ukraine, which was 2001 to 2004, we were working with the Ukrainians to help them move forward towards democracy, and they were, taking some steps in that direction. But corruption wasn't really a focus. And so fast forward to 2014, after the Revolution of Dignity, and what that term means to Ukrainians is that dignity means I'm going to be treated the same way as you are treated, regardless of whether you are the president and I am a pauper, or whether you're an oligarch and I'm just, a small business owner. It's all the same law. It's rule of law, and I will be treated with the same dignity as you are. So that was the core of why people went out on the streets. That they were so angry at the corruption that was stealing their patrimony and not allowing them to move forward. And I was really shocked in my first meeting with President Poroshenko. he raised corruption as an issue and what steps the Ukrainian people were taking, which, my first time in Ukraine, it would have been considered impolite at a minimum, certainly not diplomatic, to raise corruption with the president at the time. So it is true that Ukraine had a real corruption challenge, but it is also true that the reason that we know so much about it is because the Ukrainian people themselves raised up the issue, made it part of a change of government, and demanded that their leaders do something about it. So I think that that's an important thing to understand.
Revolution of dignity, what a great phrase, and has a corresponding one in the United States, blind Lady Justice. So, a question,
Yes.
if I can zigzag a little bit, you wrote and talked a little bit about this in your book, how unsettled or disturbed you were the first time you saw the new President Trump speak in his inaugural address. Tell our audience a little bit about what was disturbing to you about it, what it telegraphed to you, because at that time you were already the ambassador to Ukraine.
Yeah, so I was watching from my living room at home in Kiev, and it just seemed such a dark speech. It seemed not an aspirational speech. When I think of presidents at their inauguration, I think of them inspiring us, not with crazy kind of way too optimistic things, but inspiring us with uh, their rhetoric and with their vision for the future. And this was a dark and almost paranoid speech, and it made me worry about what would come next.
And Marie, tell us a little bit about the things that you reveal in your book for the first time about the meeting in 2017 between the Ukrainian president and the new president, Donald Trump.
Yeah, so that was a very interesting meeting, partly just because until we walked into the Oval Office, we didn't know whether there was actually even going to be a meeting with President Trump. There had been a prior meeting with the vice president, and then we were placed in a holding room, and we didn't know what was going to happen next. And believe me, that is a really uncomfortable place for the head of a country, a president, to be in. And let me just tell you, as the U.S. ambassador sitting in that room with him, it was uncomfortable for me as well. And then we were brought towards the Oval Office. We knew there was going to be a photo opportunity, but we didn't know whether there was going to be a meeting. So they brought us into the Oval, and when the photographers left the room, I was waiting to see what was going to happen. And fortunately, then there was a meeting, and the two presidents discussed a number of issues, including the war and in the east of Ukraine. And the thing that really stands out to me the most is that President Trump turned to his national security advisor and asked whether we have U.S. troops out there. And I found that like everybody kept their game face on, because you can imagine that the Ukrainians would have loved to have U.S. troops out in the east in the Donbass fighting for Ukraine. But everybody, kind of kept their composure, and it was explained that no, there was while we had training troops in the west in Yavoriv at that base that was just attacked a couple of days ago, but no, we didn't have American soldiers fighting in the east. And to me, that was kind of a telling moment and I wasn't sure what it indicated. Did President Trump not know that that Russians had invaded the East and the Ukrainians were fighting the Russians, which would have meant that we would be fighting the Russians if we were there? Or did it mean that he just didn't know where his troops were? I didn't know which was worse.
What a statement. And, there were a lot of gaps in his knowledge. There were also some leaders with whom he had a very special and close relationship. You wrote in your book about how much you saw Trump toadying up to Vladimir Putin. What do you think is the reason he was so obsequious to a world leader who really wasn't on par with the United States, wasn't really a true threat to the United States in the way that we think of it? Why do you think Donald Trump was so, again, bowing at the feet of Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, it's kind of a mystery. I I look to what others have said about the president that, he just really admires strong men and was kind of envious of the pretty all-encompassing power that the Russian president has, and was, admired that and perhaps wanted to emulate it himself. I also wonder, and I'm not suggesting anything improper at the moment, but it's well known that Trump had wanted to, have a hotel or other businesses in Russia, and that goal had always eluded him. And so, maybe thinking to the future post-presidency, maybe he wanted to make sure that that he would be well received. I don't know.
Well, Marie Yovanovitch, I'm sorry that we are out of time. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. I could ask you questions for another hour, but I will urge our viewers to take a look at your book and learn more for themselves. Marie Yovanovitch, Lessons from the Edge. Thank you so much for being with us today at Washington Post Live.
Thank you.